Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios, and welcome to a long overdue edition of Gear Curiosities featuring the B revision of the legendary Mesa Boogie Mark IV. I could literally talk about this amplifier all day and tack on a few more days if we talked about all the Mark series, but in the interest of time, there is absolutely no way I'm going to cover all of the features and all of the tonal possibilities you can get out of this amp, but I'll try to give you a wide spectrum and kind of cover most of my favorites here, and of course go over some of the oddities about this amp in terms of how you use it, how you dial in sounds, and what makes the Mark series so special. So I only realized recently that I haven't made an in-depth video of this because I've used this countless times at this point on this channel, anywhere from a pedal platform to various tone engineers, because it just kind of does everything. Of course, it does some things better than others, but I'll try to make the argument in this video that if you need as many tones or play as many genres as I do, and you want to achieve that with one amplifier, this is one of the better candidates to do it with, and I'll show you why. Now, where to begin with the Mesa Boogie Mark series? I guess we'll begin at the beginning, and I can make a whole video on its own talking about the evolution of the Mark amps and Mesa Boogie as a company, but I suppose for the short version, it goes something like this. What would become the foundation of the Boogie amplifiers actually started its life in the late 60s as a hot-rodded Fender Princeton circuit, and apparently it was a bit of a practical joke at that by, of course, Mesa Boogie founder Randall Smith. The story goes that Carlos Santana plugged into one of these and exclaimed, "Man, this thing boogies," and the name stuck ever since. Apparently, they weren't allowed to file that as their actual company name, so Mesa Engineering was the official title. Hence the combined Mesa Boogie branding, which is why you see Mesa Engineering on some more contemporary products. You still see Boogie on this with the classic logo. Some of the 80s and 90s Boogie heads have Mesa Boogie on them. So there's like 3 or 4 different logos for a single company. Fast forward a few years to the early 70s, and Randall Smith is now creating these amplifiers from scratch, and the Mark I combo is born. It more or less sounds like the clean channel on this amplifier and the ones that succeed it, with all the clean output and increased headroom that the original modifications provided. This was kind of their staple for the next decade, up until the early 80s with the introduction of the Mark II, starting of course with the Mark IIA, which apparently holds the distinction of being the world's first channel switching amplifier, which is kind of crazy to me, but upon reflection, I can't name an amp that came before it that does that, so must be true. Of course, you can now access a dedicated rhythm and lead section with the click of a foot switch without having to physically unplug cables to like a bright or normal channel. This also introduced the now iconic 5-band graphic EQ for reasons we'll get to shortly, and that of course was followed up with the 2B, which again apparently is the first amplifier with an effects loop. I actually learned quite a bit doing research for this video, as you can tell. Then everybody knows what comes next. The legendary Mark IIc and Mark IIc Plus, which became benchmarks for high-gain guitar tones going forward, and in my humble opinion, it hasn't really gotten better since then, only different between, you know, souped up plexi circuits and 5150s and your rev generators and all these newer designs, even if they're not really all that new. It's just kind of different takes on it. To me, The 2C Plus just kind of nailed it right then and there in the early 80s. The Mark IIs were, of course, succeeded by the Mark III in the mid 80s and was subsequently produced for the next decade or so, and introduced a third channel, kind of a crunch mode between the rhythm cleaner sound and the higher gain lead tones, although most of the controls were still shared at that point. We also have the simulclass option, which is a feature we'll discuss a little more in depth in a moment. And if you thought the 2s were hard to keep track of, then you'll have a real hard time with the 3s, because there's the red stripe, black stripe, green stripe, purple stripe, probably 2 or 3 more I'm not naming. And some of them are considered to be the absolute best representations of the Mark series ever. Some of them are considered to be lemons, and it's no guarantee. If you get like the particular red stripe, some of them, it kind of depends on the serial code range and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a mess, to be honest. So if you're hunting one down, you're probably better off playing it and judging for yourself. The dawn of the next decade saw the release of the Mark IV, which is, of course, the amplifier we're talking about today, and brought all kinds of new features to the scene. It was produced for the first few years as the revision A, but afterwards as the revision B, which is the one that I own. And you can tell the difference by looking at the back of the amplifier. Sometimes you can go by the front logo, but that's not always accurate. If you look around back, though, the revision B has a foot switch for reverb, and it also has a stereo effects return. It's not true stereo, but you can actually send one of those sides to a satellite power amp if you're using kind of a wet, dry, wet, or even a wet, wet setup, which does add to the versatility of this amplifier. This was made between the revision A and revision B for almost 20 years, which is kind of insane, up until the release of the Mesa Boogie Mark V, which has been produced since about 2009 and acts as kind of a best of for all of the Mark series that came before it, adding in some features like MIDI and dedicated control knobs for all 3 channels, a couple of new modes, stuff like that. And it doesn't look like the Mark V train is slowing down anytime soon, with the release of not only the full-fledged 90-watt head, but a 35 and 25-watter as well. And then, of course, we have the John Petrucci signature 2C Plus reissue with 2 lead channels and 2 graphic EQs. With all that out of the way, you might be wondering, why did I go for a Mark IV then, if the 2C Plus and Mark III are kind of, or at least some of the Mark IIIs, like the holy grail of this amplifier, and the Mark V does basically a little bit of everything, then what gives with this? Well, it's basically a combination of 3 factors: price, availability, and tonal capability. And I think that's what really makes this amplifier a sweet spot for someone who wants to get into the Mark series like I did. This isn't a new product, so kind of in the same vein as my single rectifier overview, you're not going to have to pay full, Mark V prices for it, and those do get expensive. Now, you can't get them as easily as a Mark V. You can just roll up to Guitar Center or Sweetwater and grab one. But they're not nearly as hard to come by as something like an original 2C Plus, and they're definitely cheaper than that. So this one ran under $1,000, which costs less than a brand new Mesa Mark V 25, and definitely a lot less than, a lot of the 2C Plus or even some of the better Mark IIIs. And on top of that, it has a lot more features as well. It doesn't quite match the Mark V in terms of ease of use or the amount of modes. You don't have like 3 clean channel modes. You certainly don't have, all these different switches and stuff on the lead and rhythm too, but there's enough little options on the back. There's enough, pull switches and stuff that you can pretty much cover all of that ground to some extent. And especially if you're not afraid to pair it with a pedal or 2, then this amplifier is on top of the world as far as I'm concerned. Now, there are a couple downsides to buying a, almost 25-year-old amplifier, in that there's probably some things that aren't going to work correctly. In my case, neither of them are detrimental, but if something were to go wrong with this amplifier, I am dreading what the technician would charge for it, because, well, the circuit's complicated, to say the least. On this amplifier, my foot switch doesn't work properly, which is actually not a big deal at all, because this has auxiliary switches for basically everything. So I just use a different cable in my mini amp gizmo to control the channels and stuff. And the spring reverb tank is also kind of dead. I did remove it. I thought about replacing it, but I'm a pedal kind of guy, and I like stereo reverbs, which obviously that's not going to do. Therefore, if you hear reverb in these demos, and there are a few spots I'll put it in, it will be through a plugin, a spring reverb emulation. So it's not coming from this amp, but I wanted to give you an idea of what it sort of sounds like if you were to have one. So with that, I think we can finally launch into the overview of this specific amplifier. And if you thought the history of this was complicated, just wait. The Mark series has a reputation for being notoriously hard to dial in, and I think that's a bit unfair because when you get into the ethos of this amplifier, I personally find it to be very intuitive. But if you're coming at this, as someone who's used to a 5150 or a Fender Twin or a Plexi, yeah, it ain't the same. You're not going to be able to just crank everything up and expect it to sound the same as if you had everything dialed in your other amp. It just does not work that way. Some of these channels are a little simpler than others, but especially for the lead mode, you have to throw out everything you know about other amplifiers and take this on kind of a control by control basis. The one downside to this, I would say, is a lot of these controls are very sensitive. There is also kind of a running joke among Mark series users of especially those that tour or gig with them, those saying, if you touch one of these controls, I will chop your fingers off because, treble from 7 to 7.5, some days it could just sound completely different. It's crazy. And I think some of the way these pots are tapered or even how loose or tight they are can be detrimental. And that's why working with the digital models of this can be easier sometimes. But with that, we'll go through each channel and talk about what makes them strange, or in some cases, not so strange. The biggest departure the Mark series makes from a traditional amplifier design is the preamp tone stack is actually pre-distortion, which doesn't sound like a big deal, and it's really not a big deal on the clean channels. But once you start getting into the higher gain stuff, it makes all the difference. You can kind of think of it like, with Rhythm 1, the cleans, if you stick a graphic EQ pedal in front of a clean Fender Twin, if you scoop out 800 hertz, it's going to sound pretty scooped. It's pretty linear at that point. We're not crushing the dynamics too much. It's really not even adding much distortion, maybe a little bite here and there. But for the most part, you can kind of just treat it as one linear process. That does not happen on the lead channel. And you can kind of think about it like sticking, that aforementioned graphic EQ or especially a tube screamer-like pedal, where if you've got a flubby amplifier like say a Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, you stick a tube screamer up front, boost the level, and especially turn up the tone control, what happens? Well, the low end becomes tighter. You don't get all that flubbiness out of chugs, but the overall output frequency response of the amplifier really hasn't changed that much. It still sounds like a dual rectifier, but the distortion characteristic has. And that's pretty much what happens on this amplifier, where lead, treble, bass, and mids is more or less like having a pedal stuck in front of this at all times. And that has some really weird consequences. So in addition to having two other lead, drive, and gain controls, which is already kind of strange, some saturation options when you pull them out, you've got a bass control, which kind of covers the low end. So if you want to tighten it up, turn it down. If you want like a woofy fuzz type thing, turn it up. Mids, which is a rather wide band, but sort of subtle effect that you really have to dial in with conjunction on everything else. There's some settings you can get by at 0. There's some things that sound great at 10. Very, very versatile and sounds good on about its entire spectrum. And then the lead treble, of course, accentuates high end and helps to tighten up the sound, but it also acts as a gain control of sorts because it raises the whole level of the signal. So that is nothing like how a Marshall style tone stack would work. And then you add in on top a presence control that both cuts and boosts high frequency instead of just acting as like a feedback control thing. So the consequence of this layout is now we don't have a post-distortion tone stack like basically every other amplifier does. And you need one because without any other EQ enabled, this thing can sound very, very honky on the Rhythm 2 and lead channel. You can kind of get it to work depending on what cabinet you're using or if you use some other outboard gear, but it's not pleasant. So that's why they introduced the graphic EQ. And I don't know if they were just trying to save space or just wanted to be different, but it's kind of a weird thing to even see a graphic EQ to this day on a guitar amplifier, you know, we're used to GEQ pedals and kind of fine-tuning stuff here, but this is a pretty wide band affair here, you know, whereas something like a 10 band is kind of like surgical cuts here and there. This is more or less a machete hacking up your frequency response. And objectively speaking, this isn't a great GEQ. You know, some people freak out that it's solid state and whatever, but that doesn't even matter really. The thing about it though is most of these frequencies aren't even labeled correctly. 80 to 40 are pretty close, within like 10 hertz or so. 750 is closer to 723, I think. 2200 isn't too far off, but it ain't exact. And like 6600 is actually closer to like 44, 4800 hertz. So don't go by the numbers, go by your ears as always. But most of the time you're going to end up with something that looks like this, a big cut to 750, because that's what most guitars do in that range, something like 600 to 800 hertz. And everything else will be kind of to taste. These are also like, I think 1.3 decibel per octave filters, even though the design specs want them to be tighter. Either way, no matter how good or bad you might view this part of the circuit, it is an integral part of the Mark series sound. Now, I'm not going to use any other outboard gear except for like distortion in this review here, but I highly recommend that if you've got the space on your board, and especially if you're using the effects loop anyway, another round of EQ, it can really help bring this amplifier to life and, you know, help clean up some of the stuff that this misses. So all these things combined just make this a sound that it's unlike any other amplifier out there. Whether it be good or bad in your opinion, it kind of depends on you. Before we go over the preamp channels, let's talk about a couple other switches that you can play with to get wildly different sounds or even power levels out of this amp head. You might have noticed over here, this power switch is 3 positions. So off, full power, and tweed power. With everything else set to default on full power, you're getting a full 85 watt output on this amp, which is kind of a weird thing. You know, usually it's like 50, 60, 100, 120. We'll talk about why very shortly. But on the tweed power setting, you get closer to 50 watts. So, you know, especially if you're playing on the clean channel or you want something that's a little more gig friendly, then that's especially a good option to look at. And you can combine it with a few other switches around back to make that even lower. This middle right section then above the speaker jacks are some of the more important switches on the amp. This mid-gain control will switch from the default harmonic section to add a little more distortion, kind of crushes the dynamics, and as a result, you lose some higher order harmonics. But, you know, if you're going for all out compressed recording tones, then this is actually can be a really good option. I'll only take advantage of it in a couple instances here, but I find it loses some definition on higher volume levels. So if you're playing out loud, I tend to still prefer harmonics. The next one is especially interesting. This is the simulclass switch. Now on class A, we're only using 2 of these power tubes and playing in the regular Class A configuration. This is, of course, like, you know, your Vox kind of power amp configuration, which, as we talked about in the past, is more of a feel thing. Unless you really crank this amp wide open, you really can't hear a huge difference, but it does feel cool. You know, it's a little faster, and if you combine that with the tweed power, you get some pretty interesting results. Simulclass, on the other hand, is Class A and Class AB at the same time. Not to be confused with Class AB. This is Class AB and Class A, so it's like ABA, it's a weird thing. This is supposed to sort of act as a compromise between the architectures and tonal capabilities of both the Class A and AB circuit designs, and it's something that you'll pretty much only ever see on Mesa amps because I think they have a patent on that. And then finally, a Pinto Triode switch, which also acts as, kind of another power switch of sorts, does very much change the feel and sound of the power amp, with Triode being the lower version and Pinto being the full output volume. So this is another one that's very cool to play with and brings you more in line with like the Mark II C Plus with full power, everything else. I think Triode knocks it down 10 or 15 watts. So you can actually make this amp go as low as I think 30 with Class A Triode and the Tweed switch on. So you can get like almost bedroom friendly levels out of this on its own, which is pretty cool. All the other stuff around back here, as overwhelming as it may seem, is just, options to either manually select your channel or switch it with these auxiliary jacks. You got a direct output with the slave DI, super great. Have it on all my amplifiers for direct recording. If you're recording through a load box or even a cabinet and you want a direct sound, you can do that. The other line level output is labeled recording, and that's accessed at the front panel by pulling the output level knob. And this is unfortunately preamp only, with like some EQ coloration to it. You still have to have a cabinet connected, but if you need something quick for a silent recording, it is better than nothing. All of these assign the effects loop to different channels or manually switching it. There's your reverb foot switch and mix control. Obviously, I can't show that because it's broken. And the graphic EQ assign switch, which is either off all the time, on R2 at all times, or on at all times. Or you can switch it on and off over there, which I think is the way to go because you kind of always need it on Rhythm 2 and lead, in my opinion, or at least almost always on Rhythm 2. So finally to the preamp section, which looks chaotic as hell at first, but going at it from right to left makes things a little more digestible. The output level is your master volume for the power amp. The graphic EQ also applies to all three channels if you want to enable it, so kind of ignore all that for now. These three columns are your channel volumes and presence. So there's your lead, there's Rhythm 2, there's Rhythm 1. The lead and Rhythm 2 actually have a pull shift on the presence, which changes the core frequency it's affecting, which means that when you turn them both up to 10 and pull, you'll hear no difference because it's just like bypassing it. Generally speaking, I prefer these pushed in, not pulled out, but there is a hi-fi quality to them when you shift it that does come in handy every now and then. The Rhythm 1 and 2 row here, which I label as such because they actually share a bass and mid control, is more straightforward than the ones that follow it for sure. They learned their mistake here on the Mark V. It does have separate bass and middle controls, and all the controls are separate for the third and second channel. But for here, I find once you dial in one channel to sound really great, it's harder to get the other one to sound nearly as good. So I tend to fix one of them with the pedal And you know, that was obviously a drawback that they identified and repaired going forward. But what you do have separately is gain and the treble, of course, all the master section as well. On rhythm 1, you can pull bright, which is your standard, you know, bright switch that goes across the gain pot. As you turn it up, it becomes less prevalent because you're, you know, turning up the gain anyway. But as you turn it down, more of the treble content bleeds through and it sounds, you know, more stringy and glassy. This channel can, of course, be dialed in from the cleanest of Fender cleans to some rather unique, woofy, boogie-specific tones that I really like, especially as you turn up the gain control and like the mid and bass, for instance. Rhythm 2 is sort of in the same territory, but it goes further up until like almost plexi gain levels, you know, when it's really cranked. I would call this like the boutique channel personally, because it plays well with volume roll off and it gets into that crunch territory where you think like, oh, this is sort of a different take on a Dumble amp or something of that nature, but it never really goes further than that. And for me, Rhythm 2 is definitely the most lackluster if you try to approach it as anything but that. It is a pretty decent boosting platform when you use it with the graphic EQ, but it's definitely finicky. And again, because you have to share the EQ controls, once you get your clean tones dialed in really well, you're pretty much left with only the treble, which, because it's pre-distortion, depending on how much you have the gain turned up here, it can get kind of ice pick in your ear sounding. So you got to be really careful with it. Now, this one introduces a weird concept with the pull bright, because it's not a traditional bright switch, you know, like this is the classic cap across the potentiometer. This actually introduces, just like the lead gain control, a cap across the last triode, I believe, in the preamp, which acts as basically another gain stage of sorts. Kind of think about it that way. It just kind of crushes all of that high range that lets escape through. And it can sound really good, but it doesn't sound like a regular bright switch. It's a little more linear than something like this would be. So if you're looking for that extra bit of like crackle and sizzle to your sound, then that is something you'll definitely want to pull out, as well as the lead drive here. This is a little different on the lead gain. And that's pretty much Rhythm 2. is without a doubt the most versatile channel on this amplifier, where, you know, down here on gain and drive, it's not just like, okay, roll off your volume and you have a mostly clean sound. This is basically clean. Like it sounds like a JTM 45, and it maintains a low noise floor while doing it. Of course, I prefer to just bump it up a little bit to get some grit, but if you're looking for like a blues lead sound, it's crazy what this can pull off. And then of course you turn it up 10 and you're at Metallica and Justice for All. It's one of the most versatile amplifier circuits in that regard. And I would consider these gain and drive controls to be kind of your texture of the distortion. You know, most of the time we only have one gain control anyway, but this is sort of like just your input gain. You know, a lot of VST plugins have an input gain. That's sort of what this does, just like takes a clean signal from your guitar, and well, that's how much signal we're giving it, which is an interesting thing to do, because depending on how much you're pushing the preamp, it can distort certain frequencies more than others, or tighten things up, or loosen things up. So, you know, don't just turn this to 10 at all times. Kind of play with it and dial it in conjunction with the other stuff. Drive is like your regular distortion control. You know, if you don't have gain high enough at all, then it'll sound kind of anemic and scratchy, but you find the sweet spot here, and this is kind of what controls this amplifier from being able to sound anything from extremely unique to covering territory that other amps normally would. The lead drive shares the pull bright switch that the Rhythm 2 gain has, kind of pushing the distortion over the top. It's not your regular bright switch. But the lead gain on this one has a pull fat mode, which I agree with a lot of users. There is no other way to have this amplifier set. Like, fat is the way to go. It adds like this mid saturation and low mid scoop that kind of reminds you of a rectifier in a way, but you got to experience it to really know, you know, what I'm talking about. It's the difference between like kind of flat and uninspired to just like that's the sound, in my opinion. So there are a few ways to dial in this amp to be really cool without it, but it's stringy and unsatisfying without it. Once you get used to this, you just can't go back. And obviously Mesa thought the same, because the tri-axis, which, you know, is kind of the best of in a way, also has the fat switch kind of enabled by default on all of their Boogie channel emulations. Then, of course, that finally leads us to the tone stack. And like I said, lead treble is basically a gain control. I would kind of dial these in conjunction with each other to reach the amount of high-end saturation I'm looking for and overall gain. And then the other two are, you know, how much low end do you want to let through? Most of the time, you want to keep this really low. And then mids is kind of like rounding out the sound. The Hetfield sound is basically 0. The John Petrucci sound is 6, 7, or even beyond. You can actually do some really cool things by turning treble low, cranking mids, cranking the presence. There's too many combinations to ever go over in one video, but all this combined is why people have a hard time with this amplifier at first, and I can't blame them, but this is exactly the reason that it just covers so much ground, because you've got output, frequency response, you've got the characteristic of the distortion, kind of manipulating your guitar sound. It's just a beast. What else can I say about this magnificent piece of gear? For a lot of people, this is probably all you would ever need. And if you're not afraid to put a couple pedals in front of it as either a boost platform or even a clean pedal platform, or on the lead channel as something to boost into the gent territory, almost hesitant to say that word, then it's like perfect in my opinion. I would take this 10-to-1 over a bog standard boosted 5150, partially because so many people have done it to death and I'm kind of sick of the sound. But this just hits all those right frequencies for me. I love the texture. If you push it wrong, then you kind of get into like a rah, compressed sound that I don't really dig all that much. But this amp is just like pre-produced almost, which some people do criticize that, they say, oh, it sounds too compressed. To me, it's the opposite of compression. It's almost like maximized, which is the same thing on the flip side. But instead of like squashing your notes, it just feels like it takes the most minute input of your guitar and just cranks it up to 11. And it can be very unforgiving to play for that reason. But once you get used to it, almost all other amplifiers feel subpar because of it, except for like on the flip side where you have like a really wide open kind of amplifier sound, whereas this one would be the more Americanized, produced in the box kind of tone. So it definitely scratches a particular itch that others don't, and maybe some people would still need something else to fill the gaps that this doesn't cover. But if I had to choose one amp as like my stranded on an island rig, yeah, probably this one. Maybe the Mark V, just because I'd have more toys to play with. But as far as the ones that I own, yeah, probably this one. And that's why this is probably going to be the lead amp on my next project. And it might be the amp that does everything on the next Cedarum incarnation, because I recorded that EP with the AX8 models of the Mark IV. Sounded awesome. If I had had this amplifier by the time that I began recording, I probably would have used it. But I did play this on the live playthrough, and it worked spectacularly. So yeah, can I recommend it? Probably more so than a lot of the stuff we've covered on this series so far. It's just hard to find. And again, I don't think most people need a tube amp this day and age. But if you're going to get one, this is kind of like that gas killer, in my opinion. There's been so many amps I've looked at or, heard demos of and thought, oh man, that's unique. That's cool. And then I plug into this and I'll tweak for 10 minutes and then it's like, oh, never mind. I've already got it. So that is the magic of the Mark series. It can be kind of hard to get along with at first, but stick in there, and perhaps one day you can join me in this Mesa Mark series fan club. Any other questions and comments, as always, please leave them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.